get started. A few people that are supposed to be with us for the first panel are not yet online, and we hope they're going to join as we go. So, I begin first by saying welcome. And I begin next by recognizing the history of the land that we meet upon. I recognize these as the ancestral lands of the Kori, the Sun, and the people of Kamisa. I pay recognition to those who nurtured and kept the lands, and I recognize the historical occupation and theft of the land, the systematic elimination of the people from this land, and the repopulation of this land with people from new lands. I recognize that some came with guns, that some came under guns, some came with whips, some came under those whips. I recognize the blood and sweat spilled in honor of this land and the people that it holds. I recognize too the struggles for liberation upon this land. While we released ourselves from racial domination almost 30 years ago, others remain under settler occupation. And so I recognize and invoke the memories of the people of Palestine, living under Israeli apartheid, resisting the genocidal war against the people of Gaza. And I recognize other forms of war which destroy people, animals, and land across the continent, from Sudan and the Congo. We remember those lost and commit our solidarity. We do this in the name of change, justice, and our commitment as an articulation of care, love, and freedom for all of us. And I recognize too that this university sits upon land that was taken from others, at times even built upon their graves. Because of this, we call upon and thank their ancestors for their continued protection of ourselves. And we commit ourselves to never repeating the past, never allowing us to forget the very banal nature of violence and injustice. When we have forgotten that, as in 2015, our youth have reminded us that the struggle is not over. They took center stage then and paid heavily to jolt our memories. While our struggles have morphed and shifted, the goal of freedom from want, the struggle continues for adequate food, health, housing, education, and care, which are not available to the majority of our people. And our present systems of law and governance do not enable the realization of these freedoms either. When Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall raged against our forgetting, they raised a flag detailed with the intersectionalities of oppression that had become everyday for us. It was in that atmosphere that I arrived at UCT in 2017, recruited into the Gender Studies section by our dear Professor Jane Bennett. While I knew little about the undergrad program here at that time, I knew for a fact that gender studies students were having an impact. They were schooling UCT and the entire country on the incomplete transition from apartheid into democracy and freedom from want for all our people. And if you didn't know before the value of studying gender as a matter of studying the everyday machinations of power in the mundane and the ordinary aspects of life, then there it became obvious. And so I recognize and salute the students of this university for their everyday struggles in making this a space that is real, that is human for us all. Good morning, my friends.
Morning.
My name is Fatima Sidat, and I hold the honor and privilege of being the head of this beautiful African Feminist Studies department. I welcome you to the launch of the first African Feminist Studies department at UCT. We are not the first, it's not the first time we exist at UCT. It's the first time we've taken the name African Feminist Studies and become a department. Many of you know the department in its earlier forms as Gender Studies, and even before that, you will know the African Gender Institute. Today we acknowledge and celebrate that long and rich history. And today we also plan and dream about the coming 30, 50, 100 more years. The AGI began as a research space that offered a coursework master's and eventually an undergrad program. Since 2001, we've grown in that endeavor, so much so that annually we work with over 1,000 students from undergrad to PhD level. In the process, we've carved out a larger space for ourselves at UCT. And going forward, African Feminist Studies will be the academic department responsible for teaching the next generation of UCT feminists. The AGI will continue as a feminist research unit at the intersections of research and activism, taking feminist thought from the classroom to the community, and ensuring that community activism remains relevant within the classroom. AGI will continue to host its own research projects, work with students, staff, and academics. Collectively, we are a staff of 10, and I hope everybody's in the room, because I would like to take a moment to introduce us all to you as we begin. And I begin with the heart of our work, the administrative center that holds us together. They are, and I would like to ask my colleagues, and they won't like me for this, to please stand as I take their names. They are Warda Daniels. Warda's on her way. She's got elder care duties, so she'll be in shortly. Hilda Ferguson. Karen Flowers. And in the AGI program, Vanessa Ludwig. Fidel Parks. Back. Imamaleng Masita. At the back also. Our teaching faculty, Professor Benita Moman. Dr. Zamamba Mkhize is not here. And Dr. Nizi Swatiti. And we do not forget Emeritus Professor Jane Bennett. I want to ask my colleagues to stand, for a moment, just for a moment. I want to ask my colleagues to stand. And I do this, and I hope the people on YouTube can see as well, and the streaming spaces. I do this to ask you to look around, our guests to look around, so that you can know who to hold responsible when things go well and not so well. But I also do this so you can look at these faces to know that these are the faces you can dream with. Dream African feminist dreams. Thank you, colleagues. Are there any tutors or TAs in the room? I'd like you to please stand if you are here. I see some people. Tutors, TAs, please stand. They're at the back. And Caitlin didn't stand. Jane is letting us know Caitlin didn't stand. And if I could ask you to stand one more time, please, forgive this, but I have a little bit of method here. If you could just stand one more time. And I ask us all to look at these faces, because this is the next generation who's going to be doing the dreaming. They will be taking us forward. Thank you so much. I'm sure I'll hear about this later. That concludes my welcome to you. Next, I have the very significant privilege of introducing our dear Dean Shose Kesi, who will open our event for us. Thereafter, we'll have our first panel, chaired by Benita Moman. We'll then take a bit of a break and do a little activity, because we must get into our bodies a bit. And then we'll have our second panel, chaired by Dr. Nizi Swatiti. And that will take us through to the end of the day. Thereafter, we'll have a lunch celebration, so stay for that. Let me begin with introducing our dear Dean. Professor Shose Kesi is Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Cape Town and Professor in the Department of Psychology, as well as co-director of the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa. She has published on the psychology of racism in higher education and decolonial and pan-African approaches to psychology, and we're really happy that she's joined us today. Thank you, Professor.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I can start with some acknowledgements. Our Vice Chancellor, who is, I believe, arriving a bit later, so Professor Musa Mushabela, to our former Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, Dr. Mampela Rampele, to our host, Head of Department of African Feminist Studies, Professor Fatima Sidat, her departmental colleagues, to all of our esteemed colleagues who are present and online, to our students, past, present, and future friends, good morning and a very warm welcome to this exciting event. It's not an easy task to speak about great efforts and hardships and sacrifices that have paid off in nearly 30 years in just a few minutes. It would need a 30-hour-long speech, but even if we had 30 hours, I don't think it's possible to talk about the work of nearly 30 years. So allow me to just mention a few key moments, starting from the beginning. In 1996, as the first Black Vice-Chancellor at UCT and the first woman, Dr. Rampele was charged with an explicit vision to have equity at UCT. For Dr. Rampele, this meant the promotion and support of African women into all spheres of leadership, research, policymaking, and teaching within higher education. Dr. Rampele had liaised with Dr. Catherine Namudu, that we must also acknowledge as one of our cornerstone founders. This spirited vision of Dr. Rampele met with the fiery brilliance of Professor Amina Mama, who's with us online, I believe, and who became the inaugural chair of the African Gender Institute. And this institute grew with the Faculty of Humanities, offering a wide range of areas culminating in an undergraduate and graduate degree, as Professor Sidat has mentioned. And the AGI fast became a host of African researchers and writers as residential fellows, all of which manifested in the incredible achievement of establishing Feminist Africa, Africa's first Pan-African feminist academic journal. This established UCT as a base and conduit for regional networks training around feminist organizational development and occupational sexual harassment policies, things we may take for granted today. So we are proud that the brilliant cohort of students we attracted over the years had their road paved by iconic women from across the continent to build a rich heritage that they have taken to greater heights. To acknowledge those who have paved the way, I would also like to make a special mention of Professor Elaine Salo, and we acknowledge Professor Salo and many of her colleagues over the years that have been doing feminist work through a range of fields, forming this space as a truly transdisciplinary space of knowledge creation. We inherited a rich tradition of intellectual rigor that broke with a lot of traditions. And I want to share an anecdote of one of our former students who told me that after being a graduate in one of the departments in the Faculty of Humanities, they enrolled for postgraduate studies at the then AGI, and it was the first time they could use I in an academic essay. And the shock with which they received this after years of having it drummed into them that they cannot use I in academic work, that shock soon moved to affirmation not only of their ideas, but of their existence as an intellectual. And today, that student is a global scholar doing incredible work because of contributions made by this department. This anecdote goes some way to demonstrating how at UCT, the goal was never to confine feminist work in one department, but that it was an institutional goal in the hiring of staff, the intake of students, appointments to leadership positions, and so on. From the Faculty of Humanities, we have achieved the notable feat of ensuring that the question of gender is taken seriously throughout the institution. In a sense, it has come back full circle to Dr. Rampele's bold vision quite early on into our democracy, and that is why, in a deeper sense, this event deeply acknowledges with immense gratitude the visionary work of our former Vice-Chancellor in the establishment of this institute, then and now department. The Department of African Feminist Studies is informed by deep, rich, complex, and powerful set of theoretical debates on Africanity and gender through a range of fields. Also, always rooted in Pan-African academic activism that shifts discourses, advances critiques of neoliberalism, and challenges state formation, forces that still limit gender imaginaries and practices. We acknowledge the immense work of Adeline Africa, Helen Scanlon, Yaliwe Clark, Rochelle Chadwick, and Jane Bennett over the years. We acknowledge the new leadership and current staff members who are championing this wonderful department to even greater heights, all in the while remaining deeply rooted. I would never miss an opportunity to offer heartfelt gratitude to the administrative staff. We have heard their names already: Warder Daniels, Hilda Ferguson, Karen Flowers, and others who have kept this space administratively intact in the years of its twists and turns. We salute you. We thank you for your decades of service. Your expertise and extraordinary hard work in carrying so many projects is vital to the life of this department, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that we would not be here without you. We thank you and other past staff over the years who helped us navigate bureaucratic impossibilities. On fundraising, we thank Brenda Martin and Gillian Mitchell for their efforts in collaboration with the director over the years. At a national and continental level, we are deeply grateful to so many who have contributed to the life of the department. I will say their names in acknowledgement without going into detail of their exact support in the interest of time, because I have to cut down my speech from 30 hours. But I want to just acknowledge Professor Akosua Domako Mpofu, Zodzi Tikata, Sylvia Tamale, Charmaine Pereira, Sandra Manuel, Awino Okech, Desiree Lewis, Pumla Kola, Zetu Matebeni, Floretta Bonzaya, Barbara Bozo, Helen Scanlon, Elelwani Ramugondo, Sophie Oldfield, Sadia Sheikh, Janet Muritaki, Amina Wahood, and so many more across the world. To our past deans and acting deans who were true allies, we acknowledge Sakela Buhlungu and our beloved late Hari Garuba. To our life and soul, greatest gratitude to our students who have been learners as much as teachers here, teaching the staff as well as each other. In your numbers, I wish to thank you, and you are welcome to continue supporting the work of this department in the amazing ways that you have been flying our flag high. So I wish everybody a wonderful event today, and thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? Ninjani. Thank you so much, Dean Shosekesi, Professor Fatima Sidat, for your words of welcome, for acknowledgements, for sharing gratitude as for our pioneers and our past and our histories, and bring us to this present moment, for introducing our former VC, Dr. Mampela Rampele. And so it's my honor to be here and to be chairing this panel as a way to begin the celebration and reflection in this department, the African Feminist Studies department. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our first speaker, first panelist, Dr. Mampela Rampele. A warm welcome, a warm welcome. She's been celebrating everybody. A warm welcome.
Molweni, good morning. Goeiemorgen. What a wonderful occasion to be here at a place. I often tell people that I left my heart, a piece of my heart was left here at UCT. It's the best ever part of my career as a woman, as an African, and as a freedom fighter. This was fantastic. I have been asked to speak both to the history and to the future of this amazing endeavor. You cannot imagine a society that doesn't talk and acknowledge and celebrate African feminism, because that's the source of life, not just for us as Africans, but for the world. This is where it all began. We live in a world that has great difficulty with the power of the feminine in society. Women as the bearers of the seed of life in all its forms and conduits of intergenerational knowledge, culture, and rituals remain subjects of awe, superstition, fear, prejudice, and curiosity. Tensions, stresses, and conflicts generated by these emotional responses to the feminine are at the heart of the pandemic of gender-based violence worldwide. Our own society has the unenviable position as a poster child of the most brutal and widespread gender-based violence in the entire world, which is not at war. We are at war with ourselves. All logic points to the importance of placing gender and feminist studies at the center of transformative curricula for teaching, learning, service, and research. This would enable the multiple generations that are within the academy to engage in conversations that promote intrapersonal, interpersonal, and institutional processes to promote mindset shifts. The academy needs to embrace the primary mission of enabling humanity to embrace anew what it means to be human. The feminine, the masculine, and the non-traditional expressions of gender that define our single but diverse human family. In my remarks, I would like to comment on the two questions you posed to me. One, what motivated me to champion the African Gender Institute? Two, where to now for African Feminist Studies? So let's start with what motivated me those many years ago to champion the African Gender Institute at UCT. There are two factors that influenced my decision. One positive and one negative. The positive one is that I had the privilege in the years 1988 to 1989 to be the first Carnegie Corporation of New York's Mary Banton Fellow at Radcliffe College at Harvard. This was an experience equal to no other in its generosity and its transformative impact on me as a single woman raising two sons and on my career to date. The one-year fellowship attracted women mainly from the USA to have access to what Virginia Woolf called a room of their own. I had a room of my own to work on whatever I chose to advance my career, and I was sharing these multiple rooms with women who were scholars, authors, artists. We received generous support, which included comfortable accommodation within walking distance of any place in Cambridge. Those of you who know Cambridge in Boston. My two sons were placed at the best school in Massachusetts, the BBN, which is a private school but run within the community of Harvard. And they could walk to school. They had an au pair paid for by this fellowship. And so I didn't have to worry about my sons. Once they get to school, I know they'll be picked up, their homework will be done, and they'll be entertained until I arrived late in the afternoon. That, for me, opened a sense of wonder, imagination, and a window into what would it take to make women truly succeed within a space that is supported. That thought stayed with me until I could find a way of actualizing it here at UCT. The other reason is a negative one. I had no intention of doing anything other than continue to build on the path that was opened by my supporters at the Banting Institute. I had gone there to write a report on my research in the migrant labor hostels of Cape Town, which really got me ill, physically ill, from anger, shame, and the humiliation of seeing men humiliated in the way that they were. And so that support at the Banting Institute opened my eyes to the possibility of, instead of a report, to doing a PhD. So I was able to do a PhD in 18 months. And it was published. I graduated in 1991 in the Department of Social Anthropology with the title, The Politics of Space. Those politics are alive and well today. And I'm so grateful that there was acknowledgement of the land on which we stand. And later that was published as a book called, again, A Bed Called Home, to bring home the idea of someone who has been so humiliated that home is only a bunk bed. The negative motivation for the Gender Institute was, against my wishes, I was interested by my predecessor, Dr. Saunders, to do a study of why there was so much gender-based violence and stresses and strains at UCT. That Equal Opportunity Research Program was established in 1992 and published as a report, which you can find on the web. And that led UCT to become a trendsetter, not just for the higher education system, but for the country. The first time that policies were developed here against harassment of any form, race, gender, beliefs, etc., and that we developed policies for employment equity for the first time. There had been talk about Black advancement, as if Black people need to be advanced, but what was not talked about was the institutional culture that prevented women and Black people from thriving at UCT, which was started as a white male college and retained that status in the culture and the way in which scholarship was done here. So where to now for African Feminist Studies? Get this background. There is a special place for African feminist studies in the academy, given the role of Africa as the cradle of humanity and the cradle of the very first human civilization. Our common human ancestors revered femininity, given women's mystical powers, according to them, to produce other human beings. They didn't know where the women found these other little things that they nurtured into adults and children. So femininity in that original human civilization was associated with goddesses and godliness. Africa's history offers opportunities to harness intersectionality of gender, age, and race, quote unquote, created by the legacy of and the ongoing colonial domination and extractive economic relationships that characterize the world. Indigenous African philosophy and values stress interconnectedness and interdependence of all in the web of life. Indigenous communities across the world retain much of this philosophical orientation, reflected in the amazing contributions that these communities all over the world, who constitute only 6% of the global human population, but they're able to successfully protect 80% of the sensitive, essential ecosystems that we couldn't live without. African Feminist Studies, built upon this rich philosophical foundation, would make a huge contribution to transforming epistemology and ontology, underlying and underpinning teaching, research, service, and the academy in general in Africa. A transformed African academic culture would be promoted by, and in turn promote, a reimagined set of futures where self-liberated generations of scholars and professionals would become transformative agents in societies. Africa is unlikely to meet the AU Agenda 2063 with the current neo-colonial political and socio-economic systems that are based on the values of governance systems that are alien to Africa. Have you ever wondered why there is this great disjunction between Ubuntu, whatever they call it in any part of Africa, and the way we behave in our governance and our socio-economic relationships? Transforming the academy and societies in Africa would free Africa from addictions to mimicry of Western materialistic, individualistic, male-dominated, misogynist cultures that are driving the horrid cycles of violence across generations and across countries. Colonialism and slavery practiced by Europeans in Africa targeted African families for destruction through the extraction of able-bodied men, denying children the security and role modeling offered by parental love and support. The impact of the legacy of destruction of the African family life drives much of the gender-based violence in our societies, particularly in South Africa. African feminist studies need to go beyond descriptions of what has gone wrong and continues to go wrong. It must create safe spaces for women and men, separately and together, to have conversations that promote healing and self-liberation of all participants. It should enable the graduation of scholars and professionals who become catalysts for healing encounters in their families, communities, and societies. Fundamental transformation of our political and socio-economic systems can only be driven by a new youthful leadership from the generation of 18 to 50-year-olds. Anybody above that should really stay behind. We need to have this new leadership emerge from African academic institutions. And I urge you, as young African scholars and professionals, step up into leadership. Don't keep complaining about the gap between the elderly leaders and yourself. Step up. Step into leadership. Africa desperately needs a radical generational shift in leadership to harness the youthfulness of its population. I conclude, UCT has work to do, Madam Dean. We are not only the preeminent university in Africa, but we have the history, the experience, and the caliber of leadership to lead the charge to help transform African institutions. African academic institutions should become fountains of healing, of reimagination, of what it means to be human, to produce inspirational leaders, to transform our continent into, once more, a leading light for humanity. African Feminist Studies must tackle research questions rooted in the understanding of intersectionality of all aspects of the web of life itself. The web of life is interconnected and interdependent. We can only do justice to high quality African feminist studies by being willing to jettison the comfort zones of siloed studies and embrace the transformative transdisciplinarity of the academy. The UN Decade of Sciences for Sustainability offers UCT an opportunity to collaborate with others, both within and outside of South Africa, to leverage the creativity and innovation offered by operating at the interfaces of disciplines. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rampile. I love that. African feminisms as a source of life. Did you hear that? It must be our tagline, African feminisms as a source of life. I love that. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences and reflections and those initial thoughts. And I've just listened to the very sort of visceral lived experiences that enabled you to be this champion for the African Gender Institute, and the fact that we're now here today as the African Feminist Studies Department. And as a single mother, you know, I think it's always important that we recognize our multiple roles and that we do things as we do other things, you know. And so thank you for those words of wisdom, a lot of guidance, a lot of challenges for us. Those of us who remain. I'm not the younger one. I'm not in the category that you spoke about, though. I've passed that category that you spoke about. But of course, we all build collectively, and we build in solidarity. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so we'll continue with the next panelist. So the next panelist needs no introduction to the AGI. Professor Jane Bennett. Needs no introduction. We all know Jane. Jane has been very synonymous with the AGI for many years and still is. And so, of course, we're here to celebrate Jane and all the work that Jane has put into building the department, building the African Gender Institute and now the African Feminist Studies Department. Welcome, Jane.
Molweni, Dumelang, goeiemôre, hi. And can I ask, please, that I am held to time? Because Jose, Dean Casey, said she had 30 hours. I could hear from Dr. Rampele's introduction and invitation to us that there could easily be a 30 hours in there. And I don't know that I could run to 30 hours, but I'm asking you to keep me to 15 minutes, because otherwise things might get a bit wild. I want to thank Benita and Fatima and Nesiswa and Zama and Vanessa as people who've invited me into this space. And I'd also like to acknowledge, not simply as Fatima began with the issue of the land, but the issue of this room. This room has seen some stuff, people. I want to firstly just note that this room has made every effort this morning, has been choreographed and thought about for us this morning in really extraordinary ways. That's Elaine's kente cloth. I know who some of this belongs to. I'm thinking of the banner at the back. I'm thinking of the plants. I'm thinking of the fact that Dr. Rampele and Prof. Casey shared a note about being red today. And I'm looking at everybody in colors and smiles and faces. And this is a horrible room. Look at it. There are no windows. The air gets weird. The acoustics are. But actually, it's an interesting thing to begin with in a moment like this, because this room was built specifically to host Center for African Studies intellectual work many years ago. And it has been held as that space through many, many moments. I remember it's in this room in which somebody who came to be DVC and then came to be something else, battled Mahmoud Mamdani about what it meant to teach African studies. I can see them both in this room, Mahmoud and Martin Hall. And we know, some of us, the story of what Mahmoud Mamdani faced as he tried to explain, this was in the late 90s, to the then humanities and, arts and social sciences faculty, they were still separate, that there was a rich, difficult, politically acute set of intellectual energies pulsating throughout the continent, which had nothing to do with teaching any kind of archaeology. Man began with a cave and a bush. It's like that was what was being taught. Sorry, Martin. He's a good archaeologist. As African studies. I remember that room. I remember seeing Mahmoud Mamdani, a man very sure of himself, looking battered by the institutional racism, and it was intellectual racism. To make Mahmoud Mamdani look battered, you have got to be malevolent. They did. Was in this room. I also remember other things much more celebratory. I remember Amina Mama in 2016, still during Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall. She came to give a set of talks, lectures. The room was absolutely packed and the electricity went. And everybody put on their cell phones. And this was a dangerous space to be in because it was so dark. So we all moved to a lecture theatre in Leslie Social Science, still with the cell phones, you can see that talk, that joy, that pleasure. It's on YouTube. Look for that talk. She did it from here to there, and that was not so long ago. And I remember many other moments, and that is why you should keep me to time. But I'm grateful to be in this room, because I could tell you about other rooms in which the Equal Opportunity Project lived in a container, through to La Grota, through to All Africa House, through to other spaces. And some of you might be wondering, how on earth did we turn from Dr. Rampele's vision of an African Gender Institute, which was actualized after a complex process in about 1997, to then being Gender Studies and the AGI, to now being African Feminist Studies, but there's still the AGI. It's a fascinating story. I'm not going to tell it now, but it's worth understanding in order to understand what a university can do to try and kill the work of Pan-African intellectual and imaginative energies. Universities are powerful. I want to start talking about the establishment of the AGI with a reminder. 1994 in South Africa, the very same 1994 that held the Rwandan genocide. In South Africa, we were in a huge muddle about the meaning of the word Africa and African. Everybody here will know the debates, some of them very ferocious, between the ANC and the Pan-African Congress, Robert Sobukwe, drawing from Nkrumah. Robert Sobukwe's Africa was Nkrumah's Africa, a set of intellectual, liberation-focused energies that was not predicated on simply the meaning of the nation state, albeit the new nation state. That was Robert Sobukwe. The African National Congress, to put it very, very simply, despite strong connections with Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Tanzania, did not see Pan-Africanism as part of its liberational work in terms of the energies to be collated. Sobukwe's Africa was very clear about who constituted the African, and it was not the ANC's non-racial, then, relationship to who constituted an African. What we were left with in 1994, most powerfully, was the ANC's decision to retain the term African as a racial classification within South Africa. The debates around that, the fights, some of us know a lot about that. The consequences have been absolutely dramatic in terms of the difficulty that most people in South Africa have about permission to recognize themselves as people with connections to the continent as much as to the ancestral histories and legacies and meanings that are now bordered by the Limpopo or other country borders. The African Gender Institute took up, I don't know why we thought we could even do it. It was Dr. Rampele, actually, who strongly believed that, although you never called it Pan-African, but you lived it, in terms of the Federation of African Women and other things like that, that in fact, whatever work was needed by the new South Africa, and there was work, one of the most powerful things colonialism did to the peoples living here is instill via language, via homogeneous cultures, via notions of education, the idea that if you cross the Limpopo, you get to London. Just like that. There's nothing there. That education could not possibly be informed by Emile Cabral, by Sheikh Anta Diop, by Zen Tadesse, by Fatou Sow. We are still there, but we're not there in the same way that we used to be. And the African Gender Institute couldn't possibly imagine itself, it didn't then, and as a space in South Africa to begin the work of taking the dynamics of sexuality and gender intersectionally seriously. That had been done from the 70s onwards. Unions were running workshops on sexual harassment and talking about women's leadership. Everybody here knows about Shamim Mears magazine, Speak, Rape Crisis, different orientation, complicated, started in the late 70s. UWC, UKZN were working with notions of gender in universities. And it was in 1991 that Desiree Lewis at a conference in Durban called white South African feminists out for writing about black women's lives as though they could. That was 1991, people. The African Gender Institute didn't start until much later in that decade. We didn't think we were new to a South African space. We were learners. We were learners, and under a lot of suspicion, I can tell you, under a lot of suspicion. We were newcomers. Who the hell were we? And in terms of what we believed we could work with was the decolonization of knowledge creation in many, many ways that saw the multiple energies, languages, yes, writers, activisms, differences across the continent as the reservoir, a complex reservoir, not contained, like a reservoir, of ideas, illumination, debate, and knowledges that deserved primary location as a space from which to stand, African feminism. And it was not easy because we were located in a university, the University of Cape Town. We faced a set of institutional difficulties. Amina has written about this, would have a lot to say about this. But I have also lived them, and so have many of the people, some in this room, over the past 25 years. The first thing that a university environment, not particularly UCT, but a university environment anywhere, does is employ categorizations that are lethal to intellectual health. Somebody of 18 arrives, very happy to arrive, and is categorized. They're digitized, literally. They have a number. The University of Pretoria, their biodata is taken. You can't get into a building without being a number. You can't get a book. You are called a student. You are not a student except temporarily. You are a complex, perplexed, emotional, joyful, sexual, excited, smart being. That's who you are. If you happen to be employed as a worker, you are suddenly in something called pay class 3. And you will work in this building and that building and whatever, and you will wear a uniform and nobody will remember your name. The end. Who? That is not who you are. You belong to your church. You have families. 5 minutes, yes. And the same with Benita, with Nesizwe, with people who are teaching. You are a faculty member. Boo-hoo. You will do this and that and the other, and then you'll be kicked out because you're too old. And it's like, actually, I'm just Jane. That is who I am, and I'm a mess. Blah, blah. So, categorization, not useful. The politics of the intellectual in a university, not useful. Siloized, and also wah-wah. So important. You don't have any learning. You over there, you indigenous person. Oh, you know about a plant. How nice for you. The end. And then the question of embodiment. We're not supposed to have bodies, people. We're supposed to have minds, and we have bodies. We have menopause. We have children. We have sex. We're happy. We're depressed. We feel safe. We feel not safe. All those things. So living a relationship to wanting to base our lives, our bodies, our thoughts, our work in the complexity of African feminisms came up time and time and time again against these currents which are normal in a university. I would have many people to thank for ways of being able to live amongst those norms. And I think that I myself, now I'm ending, was very, very, very skeptical about starting gender studies. We started as the AGI. It was a set of soft-funded programs, meaning the university didn't give us resources, although they did give us space and a building and access to admin systems, which was not nothing. But we ran programs around sexual harassment. We ran an associates program that brought people here. We worked with a lot of organizations. And then in 1998 at UCT came a huge debate about the amalgamation of the arts faculty and the social science faculty and the education faculty. Social sciences were absolutely beastly to arts. They said they brought absolutely nothing to the table. And in the middle of all this male aggro, and male aggro it was, came the option to sneak in a program on teaching gender studies. It tore the AGI apart. Nobody wanted to do it. Nobody thought that teaching UCT students, we knew how demanding it would be, it was the work we were supposed to be doing. It wasn't that we didn't think it was important, it just wasn't our work. We had to. We were told to start. We lost staff members. I was the only one that had the educational background to do the teaching. And in 1998, we offered a course. It was called Understanding Gender, which is sort of a joke. That's still the name of our first year. You can't understand gender. It's completely impossible between thinking about decolonizing the ideas, thinking about different languages, thinking about you can't do it, but it's fun to try. And 80 students who did not have it in their curriculum showed up. That was the first surprise. The second surprise was this. I mean, I like teaching. It's been my life. So it's not that I didn't relish the opportunity to engage with the 80. I did. But I was talking about the complexity of being gendered and certainly not being gendered. And I suggested to them, this class, that they go home and think very, very hard how to perform themselves so as to be recognized in the streets as the gender they thought they didn't identify with. Now, there were, of course, some people in the room who were already living gender fluidity. So, and they were very happy that this was happening. So we thought about some ideas. The next day I came in, I was faffing about, I don't know if some of you remember, that we had, what were they called, those plastic things? Not, those plastic, the overheads, no screens, people, funny plastic things that you wrote on and they smeared. It was awful. And so I was faffing about with those, and up to the desk came one Luvuyo. I won't say his last name because I haven't asked him if I can talk about this today. I have before. And he said, "Hi, Dr. Jane, here's a photograph." And he showed me a photograph, and it was a photograph of a woman. She was wearing a doek. She was standing next to a stove. She had an apron. There was a pot of stuff on the table. And I looked at him and I said, "Oh, Luvuyo, is that your mother?" And he roared with laughter. He said, "Dr. Jane, it's me." He had gone home, done the exercise completely, got it, the performativity of it, the labor of it, and I'd fallen into the trap. So, and at that moment, I realized they know everything. These young people know everything. If I can get to stand in a room with them and learn and be and have permission to speak and to hear, I will not have wasted my life, which is an important thing for me. So I echo Chose's thanks to not simply Dr. Rampele for imagining, and for Amina for the years and years of courage she brought to the position, but to the thousands of people who have thought, when is she going to stop? Now.
Thank you so much, Jane. Jane always brings color and laughter into the room. So thank you so much, Jane, for continuing to do what you did so many years ago, bringing laughter and color into the room, and teaching through your laughter and color and humor in the room. Also for the memory, again, just a reminder how important it is to remember. And I think we do so much of it in the department at the moment around the importance of remembering. But you're beginning just to tell us some snippets of the memories, of the rooms, of the spaces, of the conversations, of the connections. So again, a reminder of the importance of memory and remembering and remembering. Thank you so much, Jane. Our next panelist will be Yaliwe. I'm just thinking, so Amina Mama will hopefully come back later. Okay, so hopefully we'll come back later into the room. So we're going to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Yaliwe Clark, again, very synonymous with the African Gender Institute. We miss her dearly and happy to have her here and to listen to her reflections and her celebrations and also her memory and remembering of a time at the African Gender Institute. Welcome, Yaliwe.
Thank you very much. I hope there's no echo on your side. I'm joining you from Lusaka, Zambia. I'm actually sitting in what I consider a museum of part of Africa's feminist history. One of the reasons I'm here is to immerse myself even deeper than I had been for the 16 years that I was at the African Gender Institute, mostly teaching about African feminism. I made the choice to step back from that version of depth in African feminism into my own history and his stories and her stories of African feminism that are rooted in the room that I'm in, which is a study of my parents, Sarah Longwe and Roy Clark, who have been, quite influential in shaping some parts of our shared history of African feminism. So I'm sorry I'm not there with you in person. I always find it awkward to join a hybrid event, this weird animal that we created during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm grateful for it, but it is also quite strange for me still. So I feel like I'm talking to myself rather than all of you. I can't see everyone in the room. So please bear with me. I just want to continue beginning to say thank you, deep thanks to the team that made this possible. Fatima Sidat, Vanessa Ludwig, Benita Moorman, Wada Daniels, Hilda Ferguson, Karen Flowers, Naziswe Titi, Zama, Nkize, and the team that has brought this together. I know for sure it's something we were trying to do for a very long time before. For a very long time. Since we were constituted a couple of years ago, I was trying to get the time right, but I'm not able to do that. And I also want to thank the speakers who have led us to this point, because then I was able to choose what it is that I'm going to say, because some of the things of the deep, complex and difficult and also joyful histories have been covered even before my time. I found that I've had to speak to those years to understand who I was in the African Gender Institute and Gender Studies and the African Feminist Studies department. I've had to go to that history to make sense of who I was and who I've become. Benita, could you also time me? I think I've already taken like 3 minutes, but I also feel like I've got so much to say. If you don't pace me, I'm not sure how long I'm going to talk for.
Yes, Yali,
so,
I'll do that.
Thank you. Thank you. You can just put a message in the chat. Yeah. So I was asked to speak about my work at the African Gender Institute and the then Gender Studies, and also to just share some ideas on how I see the field. I guess it's the field of African Feminist Studies, and for me that field is around the pedagogy of it, seeing as we're talking about the department now, and that very much centers around the idea of teaching. What advice I have, what support I have. So I'm going to try and do that. Let me start with myself. I think that's easier. I came to the African Gender Institute in 2008, then a single mother of 2 children, 11 and 6. As a migrant worker, really. I had grown up in Zambia. I was already very much immersed in Zambian women's organizing. Women's rights organizing is what we talked about. We referred to it as the women's movement. As a result of this museum that I'm sitting in, that I was inevitably quite active in that space. And I moved here as a migrant worker, seeking to make connections between the politics of change from a feminist perspective and how that intersected, is entangled, is immersed in how change happens from the perspective of what was known then as conflict resolution, peace building, security studies, or the creation of security. And I came to work in an NGO, and that was my background. It was not in the academy, except for my time as a student, as Jane says, when the university packages you into a very narrow sense of the self. And I managed to survive that at the University of Zambia and later at the University of Tromsø in the Arctic Circle. I'm quite sure I almost died there in that packaging, in the Arctic Circle, combined with awful weather. So I joined the African Gender Institute from that sort of background, and I was excited at the possibility of spending only 2 years teaching African feminism and stepping into the mighty shoes and history of Dr. Rampele, Jane Bennett, and at that time, Amina Mama was just taking a short leave, and hence the AGI needed somebody to continue especially the teaching front of the work. And so I stepped into teaching. Second year course was my primary responsibility on gender and the politics of development, a course that had been curated by Amina Mama, and also, of course, with input from Elaine Sello and Jane Bennett herself. But Amina Mama's thinking had really framed how this course had been taught. And so I felt quite excited, also pretty scared about what it meant for me to take that on. And so I can now say that looking back, that what I was doing was stepping into a very critical, but yet still very conservative feminist theorization of the critique of this post-independence era of Africa that was no longer upholding its radical Pan-African vision. We're working within the idea of the nation state, or the new state after the colonial administrative imagination of borders. And African governments were developing national action plans, national development plans. My country was known, I think we're on our 5th or 6th national development plan. And so this course was offering a critique of development theory and praxis, which really was still couched in a very watered down Pan-African articulation of Africa's future. And what Amina Mama and myself and Elaine Sello, who had taught in this course, was offering a feminist critique of that narrow imagination of Africa's future, and really tearing down the idea of development itself, which is still considered radical in some areas. That development is not the discourse, is not the framing that's adequate enough for us to move Africa beyond what has been created through us and in us as a result of long extractive, genocidal and histories, long histories of various kinds of dispossession, not only economic, political, social, I would say even spiritual dispossession. And so it was a tough course. It's not an area, even though I had studied development studies at the University of Zambia, I had not studied it from this version of Pan-African feminist critique. I had some insight on it. And so I grew in the course. And I guess I'm one of those people Dr. Rampele referred to, I was in my early 30s then. Now I'm 50. I'm not in that bracket. But then I was in that bracket of like, how the hell am I going to change the world? What's going on? This is a mess. And I felt excited that I could perhaps attempt to do this while teaching this course and chilling with these amazing feminists on the continent. So I had the opportunity, the AGI being the AGI, as Jane Bennett said, not being stereotypical, not fitting into what a university imagined a course or, or an academic program to look like, you know, and I remember trying various critiques. I drew on, of course, Amina Mama, Desiree Lewis, Georgie Sikata, Lebohang Peko in the recent times, you know, feminist economics and all kinds of ideas. And of course, a critique of a securitization, militarization of the nation state. That's an area that I was quite interested in. And Amina Mama also has and continues to have that version of Pan-African feminist critique. And so I also got the students to, you know, and I could draw on my immersion in feminist movements on the continent. We could now call them feminist movements, various women's rights spaces on the continent. I could even teach. I remember Jane called me to teach about my mother, Sarah Longway's well-known in legal disciplines, well-known case against the Intercontinental Hotel. She took that hotel to court for not allowing her to enter the hotel because she was not accompanied by a man. And there's an article about that in Feminist Africa. I didn't teach it in gender and the politics of development. I taught it in the course that Jane was teaching, and that's how it was. We were so understaffed that we taught across, and we continue to do that. But I could bring in my own history, my own community of feminist history, my family's history into the curriculum, and also the work of Pan-Africanists, such as some of you may know the Council for the Development of Social Science, CODESRIA, and the Association of African Women for Research Development, both set up in the late 70s, had began already very critical Pan-African feminist thinking, not necessarily feminist from CODESRIA's perspective, but definitely from the Association for African Women in Research for Development. Critical feminist thinking. I could literally bring that in and continue the work of Amina Mama and Elaine Sello in that course. So that was very powerful for me and very framing for my own versions of African feminism. They evolved in that space. I got the class to imagine an African country, a feminist African country, if that was possible to imagine, in West Africa. And then we had our tech team, we used to call VULA, I think it's another word now, to draw this country on the map of Africa and get the class to incrementally invent, you know, different aspects of society. And that was great fun. But also I found that there was, I'm very grateful for the students. Some of them I see in the room for the deep thinking that we co-created at the time. Feminist Africa was live and kicking thanks to Amina Mama and Jane Bennett leading the practical editorial work. And I was able to be part of that team and got to publish my first academic article in 2008, which I found a huge anomaly for myself, to package my ideas to fit into the academic or intellectual discoursing of feminism that I had only began to get my head around at the time. So that came out in 2008. And the university being the university, yeah, I think it was more of a threat than a request that I do my PhD or else I'm out. So I had to get on with that. And that was awful. Jane will remember how I pulled my hair out of my head just to get started, because I would not be moved into a kind of permanent status, out of a contract status, out of a probation period without that. Thank you. 5 minutes left. Thank you. So I'll just jump. So, you know, I was listening to you, Dr. Rampela, thinking about the Mapele, thinking about, how you got that child support and, school run support and all that. There was none of that at the African Gender Institute and to date at UCT. While I studied, while we work, and that says a lot about what's wanting, right? What we mean about the politics of care as an economy, as a nation state, as all that is yet to unravel. It's the cornerstone of feminist economics, as we have begun to articulate it more clearly. And so it was a hell of a time as a single mom, as a migrant worker, in the context of South Africa, where there was another version of flux happening. If we look at that time, we had housing projects, we had economic policies that were actually taking us back, and very much dependent on the very politics that we committed at independence to be rid of. So capitalism, foreign direct investment, the World Bank and the IMF, South Africa was really emanating the very economic policies that, as our Pan-African foreparents had articulated, that we don't need, the Kwame Nkrumahs and that. It was a very difficult time for everybody, differently to the time that Jane spoke about in 1994. But I'm going to jump that period. And so the department grew, or rather the African Gender Institute's teaching aspect grew exponentially. The foundational work that Jane Bennett did, Elaine Sello, Amina Mama was much more involved, and I hope she will come back, really involved in the continental Pan-African feminist solidarity work and networking, Feminist Africa being the cornerstone of that, and continues to be the cornerstone of articulating not only in intellectual discoursing, but in our activist narration and memory telling and future telling of what it means to center our African feminist politics, our feminist African versions of ourselves, yes, as a way of life, And so the teaching part of it, when Amina Mama didn't return, we lost that momentum, I would say. And so we had to continue it differently. And I'm just going to move very quickly. With the growth of the teaching program, I was very much immersed in that until I remember Jane says, don't you wanna take on directorship of the African Gender Institute? I'm like, hell no. I have no time for that. I'm still doing my PhD. I've got so many students. I am, I looked at her and I couldn't believe, I was honored that was something that she thought I could do. She had already been leading the AGI for over 10 years since Amina Mama moved to the USA, and Amina will speak to that period as well. We went through many iterations of constriction by the University of Cape Town, being forced into separating our teaching from our feminist political work continentally and locally, and the tensions within this manifested in various tensions amongst ourselves. It was a very difficult period, and we merged into what was then called, I can't even remember, somebody say the word, the sentence that we became. Can somebody type that, what Jane said? Center for Anthropology, something, and Gender Studies. And we lived that reality from about 2014 up until quite recently, before the formation of the African Feminist Studies Department. It was a very difficult period. And I moved into being the interim director in 2017. That was after we know the roads must fall and fees must fall, very powerful student movement, in which many of our students in the undergraduate and postgraduate program were instrumental leaders in that. So Dr. Mpele Mampele, that was already happening, then. And I'm glad Mbali Matandela is going to speak to that period. She was one of our honor students. And I just want to honor also Masera Maru, who joined the African Gender Institute as a staff member in 2017, but was instrumental in one of the key co-founders and leaders of Rhodes Must Fall. And we also had Jan Louise Lewin, who was teaching with us, and I see Jan is online as well. These are students who grew through our program, who shaped those political moments of student upheaval actually not of the students, I think of the university system, which has now shaped the languaging and the discoursing of decoloniality and decolonization that has been centered at UCT in very profound ways that wouldn't have been possible without that movement. So then I had this period of directorship for 5 years, and I can't go into the details of that, maybe in conversation with Mbali's input and others. But really to acknowledge Professor Shoze Kezi, Elelwane Ramgondo, Floretta Bonzea, Jay Patha, Nomusa Makubu, Amrita Pandey, Chris Omo, all staff, professors, doctors at UCT grappling with a huge flux, great flux, important flux, decolonial flux happening at UCT. And Fatima Sidat joined us, as she said, at a time when we were just the tail end of that period of upheaval and change. And I do want to acknowledge really Masera Maru, Jan Louise Lewin, Karen Flowers, Hilda Ferguson, Wada, for the craziness that we attempted in 2018 when we hosted what we thought would be a 50 people gathering in a symposium called Dreaming Feminist Futures in 2018 in March, which ended up being over 300 people from across South Africa. We didn't have funds to continue our Pan-African level of participation, but we did have, which was quite monumental at the time, from across South Africa, feminists, activists, queer feminist activists coming together to speak across various topics. Some of them were Black feminism and the politics of care, language and reimagining African feminism, gender and the politics of violence, pleasure, sexuality and bodies, discoursing, Muslim feminisms, feminist organizing and movement building. And I remember that was the time, Jose will remember, when we were at the height of the Black Academic Caucus, the Women's Black Academic Caucus. And I remember we had a walk and a dance to the library to cover a statue of Sati Batman that stood in our library at the UCT in a way that was a version of violence in how her body was depicted and continued the violence, the bodily sexualized violence of the colonial era of South Africa, of how Black women's bodies continue to be portrayed. We honored the artist that created the statue, and we got that statue moved from the library after that. We also had the Queer Feminist Film Festival. I have to honor Masera Maru that got that started in 2018 and enabled us to explicitly embrace and network queer feminist folks that are, I still think, at the cutting edge of what it means to discourse and practice African feminist theorization. Or, praxis and theory, not disconnected. And then I think that's where our curricular change, curricular rethinking, that's one of the sources that will create the kinds of imaginations, radical Pan-African feminist queer imaginations that we are thirsty for as a continent and as the world. I'm really going to end there. There's so much I haven't said about the future, but I think I'll end on that piece. Yeah. Thank you so much. 5 minutes is definitely up, Benita, since I started speaking, right?
Thank you so much, Yaliwe. Yeah, as you ended now, and you were saying that there's still so much to say, and there is still so much to say and to hear and to learn from you. Just again listening to all the speakers this morning, I keep on thinking the second panel is entitled something about dream or dreaming, and it feels like I'm living in the dream. Been in the dreams of people like Dr. Mampela Rampela, in the dreams of Jane Bennett, in the dreams of Amina Mama, in the dreams of Yaliwe Clark, the dreaming to change, the dreaming of freedom, the dreaming for freedom. And so just listening to the dreams and learning to think about what it means to be in the dream, and moving towards freedom. Yaliwe, thank you very much. Also the co-creation, I think, Yaliwe, that you shared with us in terms of student and teacher, how it's always mutually constituted. It's never just one thing. It's never just static. It's never just rigid. We're always mutually creating and co-creating, and sharing your gratitude of the many teachers and students that you've worked with over the years. So thanks so much for connecting from Zambia, and we hope to have you with us for the rest of the day. Thanks so much, Yaliwe. We're going to call on the next panelist, which is Mbali Matandela. And Dr. Yaliwe Clark has mentioned Mbali Matandela's time and presence at the African Gender Institute.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I've really enjoyed everyone's input up until this point. I think we all have histories and present moments that draw from our histories, that come from the African Gender Institute. We all have a relationship with the African Gender Institute, and it's so interesting to understand the histories that come before my time, and also to understand what has gone on after my time as a student at the University of Cape Town. I was at the University of Cape Town between 2012 and 2016. My last year at the University of Cape Town was my year as an honors student, where I did a Bachelor of honors degree in gender and transformation. And my thesis ended up being on Black consciousness and Black feminist activism, and it looked at the activism, the Black feminist activism in Rhodes Must Fall. And I interviewed feminists who had formed Rhodes Must Fall, and I wanted to gain an understanding of their experiences as Black women in the Rhodes Must Fall movement, and how they applied their feminist theorizing to the direct action that was taking place in Rhodes Must Fall. So just to start off, I'm going to speak to the first point that I've been asked to speak about, which is about how I came into contact with the then Gender Studies department at the University of Cape Town, and how my roles have changed in the department. I've also been a tutor. I've done some part-time lecturing for the Theories, Politics, and Action course, and how all of that has groomed my feminist thinking, and it has also allowed me to apply my feminist knowledge to the NGO sector, which I've been working in since I left the department. So I'm just going to start off with how I came into contact with the Gender Studies department. So I registered as a international relations student at the University of Cape Town, and my other major was French, but I had done French in high school. So I skipped a year of French, which meant that I needed to take electives in order to complete my degree. And so in my second year, I took an elective in the Gender Studies department. And that was the second year course that Yaliwe taught. And when I took this elective, it really shaped my thinking. It really made me understand the different social dynamics that had shaped my upbringing, and it made me understand the South African context in a very nuanced way. I could understand some of the social issues that we grapple with, such as gender-based violence, um, and it really made me understand how to locate myself and locate my experiences and position myself as an activist when addressing these issues. So I then continued and decided to take on a third major. And my third major then became gender studies. I was intrigued by the different African contexts that I had never learned about, and how gender manifested in those African contexts. And this could be a reality because of the Pan-African agenda that the African Gender Institute has. I was able to understand that there are different African systems where gender exists, and gender is not some Western concept that is implemented into African society, but there are African indigenous systems that understand gender in complex ways and fluid ways. And I was really intrigued by this, and it actually enabled my imagination to travel and to understand different locations in Africa. I learned the relationship between theory and action, the differences between gender and sexuality, and I also got to understand the relationship between the personal and the political. And that was liberating. I could apply a gendered lens into any situation, and I could understand and find solutions for it. So I used my knowledge in theory, in understanding feminist theory, and I applied it to the crafting of the agenda of the Rhodes Must Fall movement. So in 2015, when I was an honors student, a group of students, and mostly Black feminist students, got together, and we had been organizing before as an organization called SAF, which is the South African Young Feminist Activists. And we had done different campaigns on campus around sexual and reproductive health, around menstrual health. And now we were faced with the question of decolonization. And so we had in the group that we were in, there were also students who came with a Pan-Africanist agenda, and those who came with the understanding of Black consciousness as a way to liberate ourselves and to understand decolonization in the university. So these three pillars formed the Rhodes Must Fall movement, and what I was responsible for in the Rhodes Must Fall movement was the writing about what the movement was, and also the out-facing writing, so the media statements, the articles that went out to different media outlets, and the poetry, all the different forms of writing we ensured that there was a Black feminist voice in there. And so from the different committees that existed in the Rhodes Must Fall movement, there was one in which analyzed each of our actions to ensure that our actions were gender responsive and they had a feminist lens. And so we called that the intersectional committee. And we used intersectionality to ensure that all of our actions took into consideration race, gender, class, age, and we ensured that all of our direct action took this into consideration. So really, my knowledge from the African Gender Institute was something that I took as theory that allowed me to implement into social movements. And then from the social movements, I was able to garner knowledge and experience and turn that back into theory as my thesis as an honors student. So there's this reciprocal relationship that I think exists and should exist between what takes place outside of the university and what gets taught in the university. And that's really my recommendation for what the African Gender Institute and the African Feminist Studies Department needs to continue doing. I think I see feminist scholars pushing the boundaries of African feminist studies and really helping us apply feminist lens to different contexts. I also see African feminist studies being in relationship with social movements and those and the civil society, and ensuring that there's this reciprocal relationship that exists and that theory is living and that is continually being advanced and being applied into real life situations, so that feminist theory does not remain as something that is taught in the ivory towers and that remains in the ivory towers, but is something that is constantly speaking to our realities. And I think more social movements need to engage with the African Feminist Studies Department to ensure that intersectionality is applied in the same way that we applied it to Rhodes Must Fall. It really assists with how meetings take place, for example, making sure we understand who chairs, who takes up leadership, and who writes and who records historical moments, because oftentimes, and what I found in my research, is that in the patterns of history and in liberation movements, Black women's histories have been erased. So my consciousness that came from the African Gender Institute really enabled me to ensure that the histories and the patterns and the realities of Black women in movements, in social movements, in social and liberation movements are recorded and are documented to ensure that we are quoted, to ensure that we are remembered, and to ensure that history is reflective of our actions, so that we don't only have male figures as leaders and as heroes and as liberators. So I think if we imagine futures, feminist futures, we really need to imagine feminist futures where there are more African feminists in leadership positions. As Dr. Mampelo Rampele said, the youth really needs to, and I still count myself in that bracket, the youth really needs to take on those roles in order to ensure that outside of the university, there are dynamics that are ensuring that the feminist agenda is centered. So there needs to really be leadership to center the agenda of feminist activists and to ensure that feminist thinking is advanced from lived realities and from the realities that take place outside of the university. So I welcome the establishment of the African Feminist Studies department. I welcome it as an autonomous department because of also the freedom that comes with having an autonomous department. You can set your own academic agendas. You're able to, it comes with the freedom to continue the agenda of transdisciplinary knowledge that has no boundaries. And I hope that the department grows its Pan-African agenda and establishes a chair to set a research agenda so that we are able to bring in alumni and we are able to bring in the influence of people who have walked the corridors of the African Gender Institute back to, and to bring them back to their home, to bring them back to their feminist political home. I think really that needs to be on the agenda of the African Feminist Studies Department. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mbali. And thanks again for the reminder that one of our principles always around the personal being political is always brings us all to a place called home. When we begin to realize that the personal is political and there's a place for us to think like that and dream like that. And that knowing and acting is always already present and always fluid. Thanks so much, Mbali. Hopefully you'll stay with us for the rest of the day. Mbali, online, continue to have conversations with us. This brings us to the end of the panel for this morning. Once again, just a deep sense of gratitude and thank you for our panelists, this morning's panelists.